Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Today's workshop is going to be focused around painting the landscape in watercolor. And whether you're watching now on Twitch or watching in the future on YouTube, please feel free to introduce yourself and interact or ask questions or offer comments. It's all very much welcome. And yeah, especially if anyone's here now on Twitch, yeah, I'd love to hear, maybe some ideas about uh, what your relationship to painting or landscape painting is, if you do it or if you're trying to get into it. And yeah, definitely if you have any questions, feel free to shout it out. I also have some references, so I'm going to post a link right now in the chat, and there is, in that folder, there are 3 different looping videos like this, and you can download them for yourself and paint along if you'd like, um, during this session or in the future. And yeah, this is a little river in Maine where I am traveling right now. So we'll begin in just a second here. Hey, Jiminy Cricket and Sour Girl. How's it going? So yeah, I'm going to kind of jump right into the painting here. And yeah, I'll just sort of be narrating my way through. Um, it's slightly sped up. I think it's at like 150% speed here. So yeah, if you go on YouTube and kind of look through some of the other Sunspace Art Lab episodes and stuff, sometimes I like to show a painting or a diorama or whatever it is that I'm working on as more of a step-by-step or even live. And today is a little different. It's going to kind of be from start to finish, the whole process, just sped up a little bit. And I think there are some pros and cons to each different way it can be done. But here, yeah, I think you'll just kind of be able to see how it develops completely. So one of the concepts and processes that you can try out with watercolor. And this is watercolor, a set of watercolor with some white gouache. So gouache is another painting medium. It's similar to watercolor, but the paint just has more opacity to it, more body, and it'll feel more similar to like an oil paint or acrylic paint or something like that. But yeah, there's a process with landscape painting that's very common, and it's sort of painting from the back to the front. So background to foreground. And yeah, the idea is that overlaps create depth. So if you start off by painting those further, those furthest things away, and then sort of encroach towards the foreground, your painting will develop this series of overlapping shapes, and it will kind of create a natural hierarchy of space within the painting itself. And I think it's also helpful because, again, to look back at the reference here, it kind of looks side by side. There's a bunch of foliage in the foreground, the leaves and all that. So it can be a little tricky and moderately annoying to have to go back and paint the sky through all of those holes in and around the foliage. It's kind of inevitable, and I think I'll end up having to do that to sort of course correct. But yeah, if you can pull it off where you sort of just nail the background and then work your way up, it's this very organized way of painting, and it's kind of interesting. Like a lot of animated films, like I just watched Princess Mononoke the other day, um, and it's amazing. And not just that, but a lot of cartoons or just hand-drawn animated things, or even digitally painted things, they really work with layers, so you can have all of your background paintings on separate layers and then sort of superimpose um, animated characters or falling leaves or whatever, right? And just kind of maintain that organization of what's in front of what. So yeah, I think some painters who've worked on shows and projects like that might do these paintings physically on separate sheets of, say, plexiglass or tempered glass or something. And you would have all these physical layers of the pieces of the landscape, and you could kind of put in between different, animated characters or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So yeah, we'll look here at the reference for a second. One of the things going on in Maine is, and I'm sure elsewhere, but it's really amazing here, is the changing of the colors in the leaves. So yeah, in this image that I'm working on, there's this island kind of in the background. I guess technically there's even land behind it on that far, far left, that little blue streak that I have. You can kind of see it here in the reference better. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, that main mass in the background, we can call that the background. And yeah, you sort of see this modulation of, greener, bluer things and bits of yellow and red. Now, as I say the names of those colors, it does sound kind of funky because it's really grayish back there, right? None of those colors are super pronounced. And to be honest, in the computer, I actually bumped the colors and the saturation up a little bit more on this footage to try to get that point across because, right, the camera and our eye see very differently. So I just wanted to make sure that the reference sort of at least had that element, and then we could kind of choose in our painting to amplify it or tone it down if we want. And yeah, part of this whole painting from the back to the front, it can be challenging because you don't have the whole context of the rest of the values and colors of the painting. So painting on white, for instance, I'm painting this background, and it looks very dark because it's surrounded by super light things. So I find, working back to front is great and all, but at some point I need to kind of key in the rest of the painting, which is sort of why I'm moving on to blocking in some of the water here. It's not just because I think I'm done with that thing in the background, but it's going to be, playing tricks on my eyes to be comparing that island in the back to just white of the paper. So yeah, I want to block this stuff in so I can kind of reassess and reevaluate, um, re, relative, re-relativize, reset the relativity of the painting um, to this new set of values, right? Because it's not just going to be the white of the paper. Yeah, and that's definitely something that I am sort of studying and playing with watercolor now. Um, yeah, it's just like, what are the lines between representation and expression, right? Or changing colors from what you see and kind of inventing things. Um, and yeah, like, what does it mean to kind of get or attempt to get at the heart of your subject matter? And sometimes I think you can tell a series of little lies, so to speak, to sort of get at that bigger sense. So to make less abstract what I'm trying to explain, um, color temperature. I think that's one thing that's really pliable while you're painting. So yeah, that landmass that I blocked in, I definitely put it in a lot redder than what I'm seeing in the reference. Right, it's much more of a brown, kind of grayish thing, especially with all those rocks. I don't really see red when I look at that foreground landmass. However, it does feel warm. Like if I had to categorize this foreground color as an average color into just one idea, one concept, it's warm, right? It's sort of red-ish. So that's sort of what I mean by getting at the heart of something. Um, in figure drawing, maybe it's the gesture or the action of a pose. In colored painting, I think it's often just the general sort of color field or the feel of a given shape or object, right? So yeah, based off of sort of distilling it down into a concept like a warm thing, I think that sort of lets you then take liberties with maybe exaggerating that warmth or simplifying it to be warm or something like that. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And yeah, feel free to comment or ask questions too, because I'm happy to try to explain things more. And yeah, something that a teacher once told me with painting that I think is really helpful, or was helpful to me is, you can kind of take some of the pressure off of yourself about making the right decision at every given point. Like, what is the exact color or value or shape or whatever that this thing needs to be. And you could instead think about it more like it's a puzzle that you're solving or working through. And oftentimes the right move or the best move is simply the move that helps you better make the next one. Does that kind of make sense? So like I mentioned when I was working on the background, at some point I needed to just block something in to the foreground and for the ocean, or not the ocean, the lake. Right, so that I wasn't just staring at the white of the watercolor paper, which was kind of throwing off my perception of the values, right, the lightness and darkness of the different colors. So yeah, the right move was simply just to put anything in there that is not the white of the paper. So then I could kind of see the background better, and I went in and worked on the background more. And yeah, once that had gotten to a decent point in the background, right now it's time to just start putting in some shapes in the foreground so I can sort of see the background better again, right? So I kind of like to think of it that way. Because yeah, it takes some of the pressure off, and it kind of treats the whole painting as almost like a sculpture, or I imagine like a ball of clay that I'm kind of working and kneading and manipulating as I go, right, as opposed to sort of executing these correct motions or procedures all the time. So yeah, once those rocks were in, I could start readjusting the color and value of the dirt around them. And I took that warm sort of placeholder and started to coat it with a little bit of a more, let's say, desaturated kind of brownish color. And zoom in here. So yeah, now I've mixed a color that's just one smidge lighter in value and a little bit more of that yellow kind of ochre color. And I'm being pretty deliberate with the mark making, right, or the brush strokes here, to try to roughly put down paint that might suggest some of the foliage, the fallen leaves and things, right, some of that rougher texture. So yeah, another thing that I'm sort of trying to practice with these landscape sketches, and it has to do with that mark making idea, right? Is sort of what is the line between abstraction and realism, and I guess right creating the impression of something as opposed to really spelling it out. And yeah, one of the fun things about sort of recording and looking back at my painting process like this is like right now there's almost a quality in everything, even the the water right there that I like as just as sort of a looser sketch. And I feel like this is a theme on practically every art episode that we do here is, I wish I could go up to my past self and yank the paintbrush away and just kind of leave parts of it. And yeah, I think that's maybe why really experienced painters and makers, might they might be able to do things really quickly is they kind of recognize the strokes of genius or whatever, the communication and efficiency um, right when it happens, and they might not need to work it and work it and work it over and over and over again. I end up spending quite a lot of time on the water in the foreground, trying to, just repainting it over and over again, trying to capture that complexity that we kind of see in the reference here, where it's like, what even is all that right there? Just so many shapes and they're moving, and I kind of get the idea, right, that there's the darker, almost upside down triangular reflections of the rocks and the rest is lighter. But yeah, the way those shapes sort of are intersecting and interlocking um, was definitely something that I was chasing a little bit later on for quite a while, right? But so it goes. And yeah, here I'm sort of loading up some. It's a splattering technique, so putting kind of wet colored paint on the brush and then flicking it with your finger to spray out dots of paint. And that's a way that you can sort of suggest detail and texture without having to go in there necessarily and, by hand individually paint pieces of rock, right, texture and all of that. Yeah, so maybe one of the concepts at work here is working from looser to tighter, right? Trying to start off more on the impressionistic and abstract spectrum of things. And then as you're working up towards your areas of focus or your focal point, then kind of getting into more deliberate, more finished, refined types of shapes and treatment, I guess. I guess it all should be pretty deliberate, I think, at least in this way of working. But yeah, what is good enough at each phase, right? And I think it's interesting too with not just landscape painting, but portraits and all sorts of uh, relatively quicker turnaround, shorter turnaround types of artwork. Oftentimes the viewer expects a little bit less from a sketch, I think. So there's this paradox that happens where sometimes the more you work on the painting and the more you work on parts of the painting, the more work you end up sort of creating for yourself because those elements of your painting can lose their sketch, their sketchiness and their painterly charm that just communicates, you know, quick, loose painting. So the more you work on it, it, those parts of the painting can enter this sort of middle ground where it might go from looking like abstract and loose, and it might just look messy or unfinished, thus, kind of creating more work for you to have to go back and address those things and bring them up even more. Yeah, hey Lori Pub and FTO Payer. Yeah, if you guys have any questions or comments or experiences of your own with landscape painting, feel free to shout it out. So yeah, now that we're getting in some of these tree elements, I'm thinking the background is at a pretty good place in terms of its value and colors, and it doesn't feel like it's jumping forward. It really does feel like it's sitting back there with atmosphere in between the foreground and the background. Now, yeah, this tree was sort of a problem for me in hindsight, kind of while I was doing it too. Right, I think it just sort of looks like a gumball or a lollipop, on a stick. I'm not terribly happy with its overall shape. So yeah, that was one takeaway for me from doing this image is, I was trying a dry brush technique where you sort of mix up a bunch of thicker paint and go in with your brush and just sort of jab the paper with the brush to get this rougher texture, right? And it's a way of trying to indicate something as opposed to rendering it. But yeah, I think with all of that physical force and stuff to get the marks to look that way, I wasn't thinking or paying attention to, the overall shape that was being created, which if you sort of average out the contour, right, or the outline of that foliage that I added, it just kind of makes like a circle, sort of, right, or like the lower right of a quarter of a circle. So yeah, if I had to go back, I think sketching it off to the side or working a little bit slower to just realize the contour that's being created, right? Or, going in with a pencil first and kind of drawing it out and then filling that in probably would have helped to make sure that it was all going to create an interesting silhouette, by the time all the colors went in there. And yeah, that's just a constant kind of thing that I'm trying to work on, which is planning versus improvising. I think some people like to work where they have a whole drawing figured out underneath, right? And then they can kind of apply the paint to that. And I've always sort of liked to, push out or sculpt out, feel out the painting as I go, and just sort of try flying by the seat of my pants, you know. And yeah, I think there's definitely upsides and downsides to that. So yeah, here I think I'm just moving around and working on some other areas. And sometimes I'll do that just to give my eye a little bit of a rest. My hand is moving pretty fast, sped up like this, but in actuality, the whole painting was, I think just under 2 hours or something. So I really was trying to move through it as quickly as possible and trying to emulate that feel of sketching like when I'm actually out on location in front of the subject. So yeah, since I'm generally trying to do it in one sitting and pretty quickly, you kind of need to give yourself little micro breaks and eyeball rests, I think, just within the painting itself from area to area to let yourself reset and actually be able to kind of see what you're doing. Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit ago, I think here begins sort of that point where I really go back and forth just trying to render out that water more. And yeah, looking at the footage here, like where it was, a few minutes ago, I think it probably almost could have just stayed the way it was. But yeah, for such a forefront element of the image, I had this idea in my mind that, I would just nail it and it would look amazing and I'd capture the beauty of the reflections as I saw it in person and as it looks in the reference. And yeah, I think that starts to sort of scoot me out of that territory of simple abstract sketchiness, and it definitely gets into more kind of just trying to render, right, which is making something just look like it looks. Um, and yeah, I'm going to try to not do that everywhere, but for this one element of the water, I did sort of have a vision in mind of a fidelity, right, that I wanted to see right there. Because yeah, sketching things really simply or abstract is nice, but sometimes just for learning purposes, I think it helps to try to really push something all the way so that you can then develop a shorthand for how to paint it looser and quicker in the future. Okay. Yeah, and I think one of the nice things in the reference, is that fade or gradation from the background sort of horizon line to the foreground, right? It goes from almost, well, not white, but that lighter gray, and then it gets darker as it comes into the foreground. And then as it comes down into the foreground, we have relatively brighter highlights, the ripples. So yeah, one thing that I like to kind of point out when talking about and dealing with watercolor is edges. So yeah, an edge is basically the way two shapes come together and meet. So imagine like a white piece of paper on a dark table or something, right, in real life. Visually, all of the edges of the paper shape are very sharp and pronounced against that darker tone, right? Or there's a million examples of this. But yeah, different art mediums are going to offer different ways to deal with edges. So something like an oil paint stays wet for a very long time. So it's often, it's a thing people do where you can paint shapes and then take another brush and sort of blend or smush together those edges to create a softer transition from shape to shape. And yeah, you might want to do that for just aesthetic reasons, or sometimes it's the texture or material of whatever it is that you are trying to draw, right? Like the edges of someone's mass of hair, right? That might be a softer, fuzzier edge than that example of the example of the piece of paper. Or, in the case of this, leaves, right? A bunch of leaves against the sky, or uh, water reflections, right? Like those might have relatively softer edges. And yeah, with watercolor, the best way to get those edges, I think, is by painting kind of what's called wet into wet. So watercolor does dry pretty quickly, but yeah, if you're working fast enough, you can put down some color and then mix up the color of the shape that's going to go right next to it and kind of paint that right up next to and maybe even into that previous layer of paint. And hopefully the edges will kind of fuse together um, before they dry, and it will give you that softer edge. Yeah, so here's me kind of going back in, and like I mentioned at the very beginning, I was trying to basically paint back to front, but inevitably you tend to have to kind of cheat that and put some sky back on top of the tree just to design and actually create the shapes that you want to see. I think what makes that tree on the left kind of not work for me is, not only does the main gestural shape of the leaves kind of create this uninteresting curve, but the trunk of the tree too is just like a stick. And This comes up a lot, like when dealing with the human figure, where you have arms and legs and a neck and, right, all sorts of things like that, where, sometimes something can look kind of normal in a photograph or even in real life, but when we're trying to translate it into a painting, all of a sudden something can feel really stiff or, not organic or not fitting, right? Because it isn't really a moving, breathing, living thing. It's a flat painting, an illusion on a piece of paper. So yeah, I think to kind of translate the mystery and the chaos and complexity or whatever you see in reality or in a photograph even, sometimes I think you need to embellish things a little bit, right? Push them. So, so yeah, I think the gesture or the shape of that tree on the left, even kind of just comparing them side by side, it's very straight up and down in the photo, but it does have that interesting kind of bend towards the bottom, right? You can really see where it roots into the ground. And I think it's taller in the photograph than how the proportions ended up in my piece. So even though it's relatively kind of a straight, uninterrupted gesture in the reference, it has this height, right? It has more lift to it. It kind of does a greater function in the composition by being such a tall thing. And then in mine, right, we have the same shape minus that cool curve, and it's more squat. So yeah, I think that's, I don't know, just me trying to kind of feel out and understand like why I don't like that tree shape that I made. By kind of breaking down the gesture and all of that. So yeah, I think another kind of issue that I was running up against here now is, and I kind of relate this issue back to the whole conundrum of planning versus improvising in a painting. It seems like I have the foliage of both of these trees kind of coming up and touching each other. And yeah, that's sometimes called a tangent in art, where you have an unclear overlap. And yeah, again, like it doesn't even look that weird in the reference, even though the trees do kind of just visually, touch one each other or one another, touch one each other. Yeah, so sometimes that's not such an issue, and other times it does create this kind of visual conundrum where, if you compare like the rocks or the trees to that far distant background island, it's pretty clear that the trees are in front of that, right? It's a very clear overlap, almost these perpendicular angles. But yeah, I'm sure I was probably considering here maybe scooting some of those orange leaves over and in front of, right, the green leaves on the left, or maybe vice versa. Or fuzzing out and just softening, right, making more quiet that whole interaction in general. to just kind of take some attention away from it. So here I'm trying to use a mask, a piece of paper, to not get the splatter all over everything. And yeah, the main idea here, not just to create that texture and save some time, but also to put some bits of paint overlapped back on top of those, parts of the sky that I painted back in after the fact. So I'm trying to kind of camouflage the process here by putting some leaves back on top of the sky. Be kind of nice if I found a camera angle that, would let us see here. So working some darker accents into parts of the rock, it seems. And we have just about 13 or so minutes left of demo painting time, and it looks like I'm still kind of trying to get a better feel for this water in the front. So, I talked about painting wet into wet. So with one brush, there are some of the highlights, and now kind of immediately I'm going to go in with these darker reflections of the darker rocks onto the water. So hoping that some of the edges just slightly blur together, fuse a little bit paint to paint, so that it's not all just these jagged, hard edges down there. I don't know what prompted that. I think just wanting to see some more texture over there on that tree trunk, and really mixed up a big glob of paint and pushed it to try to get the bristles to show their texture. So yeah, as you could see in the reference there, right, those rocks don't necessarily have this really bright purplish light on them. But yeah, they are sort of these main actors in the front of our scene. And I was just trying to give them some more life, some more presence by kind of bumping up the light and I guess dragging some darker color here to try to make some more texture and character out of them. And yeah, if you are going to have moments of shadow or light, I think it's always up to you to kind of nudge those colors into warmth or coolness or whatever kind of color you might want to see. So yeah, violet, purple, I think is an amazing color. It's almost in between warmth and coolness, right? Like reds and blues. So yeah, whether it's portraiture or landscapes, it's something you can kind of see and detect in the atmosphere oftentimes, but even just conceptually, if you're inventing it, it can be a really useful color, I think. Right? Violet is relatively warmer, I think, than those light aqua blues and greens of the faded distance. So yeah, it's looking like some kind of last little touches here, spattering some lighter greenish colors back on top to suggest flowers or just individual anythings, right? Can kind of be suggestive or evocative of detail. Oh, hey there, Nick. How's it going? Yeah, just in the last 7, 8-ish minutes or so of this little painting coming together here. But yeah, we're working on a little river scene from Maine. Yeah, I guess one thing I'll mention here too, because I talked about sort of adding that purplish color and the utility of violet as a color in portrait or landscape painting. But yeah, one thing you can play around with a lot is sort of alternating color temperatures as you step your way up and down the value scale. So if you imagine each of those rocks as like a spherical form, right? It's going from shadow kind of on the lower left, and then in the upper right, it's sort of rolling more into the light and getting brighter and brighter. Well, in painting, if you have to kind of manually mix each of those steps of the value gradation, you have the opportunity to kind of, pick just what type of color each of those steps are, right? Value being one component of a color, its lightness and darkness, and the hue or the temperature kind of being just the color index component of a color, if that kind of makes sense. Right? You can have like a dark violet and a dark blue, or a dark red or a dark green, um, and they can all feel very similar. But yeah, as you sort of mix some, let's say, white into your color to make it lighter, you might consider sneaking in some other color to change its temperature to something different than what you just painted. So if you think about a color wheel, violet and yellow are complements or opposite from each other. Red and green are, blue and orange are, and so on. So yeah, if the last step of color on the rocks was sort of violet, and I want to mix, a brighter step, going towards a yellowish is something that I'll do. Because yeah, optically, they might just blend together and kind of create a grayish color or whatever. But yeah, upon closer examination, not of the reference, but I mean, of a painting, right? It's those little details that really add up and create kind of a complexity, which, even though it might not perfectly mirror whatever it is you're looking at in reality, just having that variety, I think, goes a long way in terms of just building up this credibility and complexity. And there's more stuff to look at, right? The longer someone looks at the painting, as opposed to just, like one color getting lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, but it's all the same color, if that makes sense, like a dark purple, medium purple, light purple. So yeah, um, in portraits and stuff, kind of anything, right? Even painting like an orange, right? You could mix up a bunch of orange, and then each step that gets brighter and brighter, you could be sneaking in, blue into your mix to cool off that orange. And the next step, it could go back to bright, saturated yellowy orange, and then alternate again and again. So yeah, just playing around with color within the correct value range, I think, is a great way to kind of get more interesting things going on. Alrighty, I think we're kind of getting close to the end here. Okay, the tape pull. Oh, thank you, Nick. Yeah, do you ever paint landscapes? Sweet. Oh, there's me taking a picture. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's still in the chat, but I'll just post it here just in case you're interested. In that folder, there are like three of these different um, references from this scene, just kind of looping like this. So yeah, if you're feeling like doing a sketch or anything from sort of photography from reference, totally welcome to. And you know, if you want to, you can email it on in to sunlandsunspace@gmail.com. That's for anyone watching too, in the present or future. And yeah, be cool to take a look at it. Awesome. Yeah, so we went from sketch here. I think too this is something that I want to try out some different options. I used a water soluble pencil for the sketch, thinking like, oh, genius, you know, it's gonna just integrate nicely with everything. But by the time I washed in this, it was kind of all gone. So I don't know. It was sort of nice to have, you know, to have mapped out a little bit some of the shapes, but you know, it didn't play much of a role when I just had to kind of reinvent everything. But yeah, I guess here, you know, that tree on the left that I'm not crazy about, I did sort of give it a little bit more of an interesting swoop down here in the underdrawing. So yeah, interesting, you know, maybe using just a normal Prismacolor would be good. But then again, I also like not seeing any kind of pencil lines in the finished piece, right? It's so yeah, maybe just having to slow down a bit when working on such prominent frontal features to try to get the gesture a little bit stronger. Ooh, little lag there. I was worried it would freeze up. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Just take a quick look if we can, not break everything here. Yeah, here are some landscapes from myself and Elsie. This Washington waterfall